You were never the reason this company grew. You were just the woman I kept around while it did." Those were the words Dorian Voss, the 41-year-old VP of Acquisitions at Meridian Capital Group, said to his wife of 7 years, not in private, not in a quiet room where shame could still contain itself, but in front of 11 colleagues at the company's annual strategy dinner, with the chandelier lit above them and the wine still warm in their glasses. Lyra Voss, née Ashworth, 36 years old, sat at the far end of that table in a navy dress she had worn to 3 previous Meridian events. She had helped plan this dinner. She had confirmed the venue, approved the menu, and quietly corrected the seating chart when Dorian's assistant put 2 competing investors beside each other. No one at the table knew that. They only knew what Dorian had just told them with his easy smile, that Lyra was decoration. She did not throw her glass. She did not stand. She only looked at her husband with the kind of stillness that comes not from weakness, but from a woman who has spent years deciding exactly how much of herself to show in a room. She set her napkin beside her plate and said, quietly enough that only the nearest seats could hear, "Excuse me." Then she left. Outside on the sidewalk, the October air cut straight through her dress. She stood under a streetlight and looked up at the Meridian Capital Group sign burning gold against the dark building facade. 14 floors, glass and steel, and her family's money running like a hidden river through its foundation. Dorian had never asked about the river. He had only learned to swim in it and call himself strong. Her phone buzzed. Her closest friend, Petra Haynes, 38, a corporate attorney who had known Lyra since their college years at Northwestern and who was one of 3 people in the world who knew the full truth about Ashworth Holdings, had already texted, "I saw his face when you walked out." "You okay?" Lyra typed back, "Not tonight, tomorrow." She hailed a cab and did not cry until she was home. The story of Lyra Ashworth began the way most important stories begin, not with drama, but with a quiet promise made between a father and his daughter in an ordinary room. Her father, Gideon Ashworth, 71, founder of Ashworth Holdings and one of the most careful men to ever build a private equity firm from nothing, had called Lyra into his study on the evening of her 30th birthday. He was already ill then. The diagnosis had come 6 months earlier, and he had spent those months not mourning his own future but arranging hers. He placed a folder on the desk between them, not a gift-wrap box, a folder. "The company belongs to you," he said. "Through the Ashworth Family Trust, through Kessler Bridge LLC, and through 4 holding vehicles, I've spent 11 years building so that no one could reach it without understanding all 4 layers first." Lyra looked at the folder. "Why the structure?" "Because money attracts people who love what it can do for them," Gideon said, "not people who understand what it costs to build." She had been in the industry long enough to know he was right. She had watched her father's partners smile and circle, watched business school friends transform into people who spoke about legacy only when cameras were present. She understood the instinct to protect something real from people whose admiration was conditional. "What does Dorian know?" she asked. They had been dating for 2 years then. Gideon looked at her carefully. "He knows your family has business interests in private equity. He does not know the scale." "He signed a prenuptial agreement last month," Lyra said. "He signed it without reading it carefully," Gideon replied. "His attorney advised him to. He assumed it protected modest family investments. He did not commission an independent review." Lyra was quiet for a moment. "That isn't deception, Dad. That's due diligence he chose not to do." Gideon nodded slowly. "Some people love a version of you they invented, the version they need you to be. Keep the trust sealed until you know which kind of man you married." She married Dorian 8 months later in a ceremony at a vineyard outside Charlottesville. He had been tender that year, nervous in a way that seemed honest. He had held her hand during the vows and looked at her like she was the anchor point of something. He had finally stopped drifting toward. She had believed that look. That was the part she would later find hardest to explain, not the betrayal, but how long she had been right to believe in him, and exactly when he had decided to become someone else. Gideon Ashworth died 18 months after the wedding. He went quietly, in his own home, in the chair beside the window, where he liked to read contracts with a yellow legal pad on his knee. Lyra was holding his hand. Dorian was at a conference in Denver. He had offered to cancel. She had told him not to. She had not told him how close the end was, because she had wanted that last afternoon to belong only to her and her father. Dorian arrived the morning after. He wore an expression of practiced grief that Lyra noticed even then, the kind that resembled the real thing from a distance, but was slightly too composed. He shook hands with Gideon's attorney, Hartwell Briggs, 67, who served as executor of the Ashworth estate, and said the appropriate things to the appropriate people. He did not ask Lyra how she was until the 3rd day. She told herself grief changes people's behavior. She told herself he was uncomfortable with illness and death, the way some people genuinely are. She had loved him. She was not yet ready to let the math of his absence add up to something she couldn't unsee. Hartwell met with Lyra privately the week after the funeral. Across from him sat Nora Aldgate, 52, CFO of Kessler Bridge LLC, and the woman Gideon had trusted with the operational spine of the holding structure for 16 years. Nora was compact, precise, and loyal, in the specific way that survives board scandals and economic downturns, not because she was sentimental, but because she had built her career on the belief that institutions should serve the people who created them, not the people who happened to be standing near them when they became valuable. The trust transfers fully to you, Hartwell said. Voting control, executive authority, and board appointment rights across all 4 vehicles. Lyra looked at the documents. Timeline? Effective this week. The paperwork is already processed. Nora slid a separate folder across the table. Meridian Capital Group was your father's most recent acquisition, 18 months ago. He bought a controlling stake through Kessler Bridge at a point when Meridian's board was restructuring and needed outside capital. Lyra already knew this, but she let Nora continue because she wanted to hear it said plainly. Your husband works for a company your family controls, Nora said. He does not know this. He believes Meridian's majority investor is an unnamed institutional fund. The fund is Kessler Bridge. Kessler Bridge is yours. For a long time the room was quiet. Outside, DC traffic moved in its indifferent way. Does his employment contract have any provisions connecting him to ownership disputes? Lyra asked. Hartwell nodded. Standard executive misconduct clause. If he violates company policy or his fiduciary obligations, his compensation, equity grants, and non-compete protections are void. Lyra folded her hands on the table. Then we keep the structure sealed. Nora looked at her with an expression that was not quite pride but was adjacent to it. For how long? Until I understand what kind of man I married, Lyra said. My father's words. She spent the next 2 years watching, not with bitterness, not with active suspicion, but with the quiet attention of a woman who had been trained since childhood to read rooms, read balance sheets, and read people. She watched Dorian grow into his success the way some plants grow in fast water, rapid and impressive, and slightly too broad to hold their own shape for long. He had been sharp when they met, hungry in a way that still had patience inside it. But as Meridian's profile rose and his name appeared in industry profiles, something shifted. The hunger curdled into appetite. He stopped asking questions at dinner and started making statements. He stopped being curious about her work on the Ashworth estate holdings and started dismissing it as paperwork. He began traveling for what he called relationship building. He came back from certain trips with his phone turned face down on the nightstand. Lyra noticed. She did not yet act. The first concrete indication came from an unexpected direction. Cressida Pell, 33, was a junior analyst at Meridian Capital, who had filed an internal ethics complaint about a senior executive misrepresenting sourcing credit on a major deal. The complaint was quietly buried. Cressida had quietly left the company 4 months later, with a settlement agreement she was not allowed to discuss. Nora flagged the complaint to Lyra through the Kessler Bridge monitoring channel. Dorian's name was not in the complaint, but the name of the deal was. It was a $40 million acquisition that Dorian had presented to the Meridian board as his own origination, his research, his contact network, his negotiation. The actual sourcing had been Cressida's. Lyra read the recovered complaint twice, then she called Hartwell. I want an independent review of all origination credits on deals Dorian has led in the last 3 years. That will take time, Hartwell said. Use the time carefully, Lyra replied. While that review began quietly, Lyra continued to attend the functions she had always attended. She smiled at the right dinners. She asked after colleagues' children. She wore the navy dress, and she watched. The strategy dinner was on a Thursday in October. 14 people. A private room at a Georgetown restaurant Lyra had used twice before for Ashworth family events. Dorian had not known that. He had chosen the venue himself and told her about it the day before as if he had discovered it. She had not corrected him. The comment he made, "You were just the woman I kept around while it did," was not the first time he had diminished her in company. It was the first time he had done it with that particular wording, with that particular ease, as if he had been building toward it for years and had finally decided it was safe to say out loud. 2 of the men at the table laughed. 3 looked uncomfortable. The other 6 pretended to find something interesting in their plates. Lyra looked at Dorian one time. His eyes held something she recognized as contempt. Not new, only newly visible. The version of her he needed had stopped being useful to him. He was replacing the story in real time, and she was watching it happen. She set her napkin beside her plate. She said, "Excuse me." She left. The night she spent alone in their apartment was the night she stopped mourning the man she had married and started preparing for what came next. She called Petra first. Petra Haynes had spent 15 years in corporate law and knew exactly where her loyalty was and exactly how to be useful from that position. She arrived the next morning with coffee and a legal pad and no softening of what needed to be said. The origination review came back, Lyra told her. How bad? 3 deals, 40 million, 62 million, and a real estate partnership worth over 90. All credit to Dorian. All originally sourced by analysts who were counseled to accept research credits and move on. Petra wrote without looking up. Company policy violations? Fiduciary misrepresentation? Possibly fraud on the 3rd deal. Hartwell is reviewing whether the compensation he drew on those deals constitutes wrongful enrichment, and the settlement with Cressida Pell? Lyra looked at her hands. Meridian's legal team handled it. But the settlement fund came from an operating account, which means Kessler Bridge's capital was used to silence a whistleblower. Petra set her pen down. He used your money to cover his tracks. He used my father's company's money, Lyra said. He didn't know it was the same thing. Petra was quiet for a moment. What do you want to do? Lyra looked at the window. The same city, the same light, everything about to change direction. I want to do it correctly, she said. First the company, then the world can understand who he is. Over the following 3 weeks, Lyra moved with the precision her father had taught her. Not with speed, with accuracy. Hartwell engaged outside forensic accountants. Nora preserved all transaction records, compensation approvals, and internal communications connected to the 3 flagged deals. A parallel review began on the settlement agreement with Cressida Pell to determine whether the payout violated any terms of Kessler investment covenants. Cressida herself was located through Petra's network. She was living in Philadelphia, working at a smaller firm, and had not spoken publicly about Meridian in 2 years. When Petra called, Cressida was quiet for a long moment. I signed an NDA, she said. You signed an agreement that restricts your disclosure to third parties, Petra replied. The company's own controlling ownership authority reviewing internal misconduct is not a third party. It is the principal. Another silence. Then, what do you need from me? Your original files. The sourcing documentation you kept before they asked you to hand it over. The longest pause. I kept copies. I know, Petra said. Dorian, meanwhile, was preparing for Meridian's year-end investor presentation. It was the company's largest annual event. 80 attendees, board members, limited partners, and the senior institutional investors whose continued commitment sustained Meridian's deal flow. His name was on the cover slide. His photograph was on the program. He had spent 3 weeks working on the materials with a presentation coach and had told Lyra twice that this was the moment that would define his trajectory at the company. She had nodded both times. His assistant, a young man named Fowler Reed, 27, had noted twice in passing that the presentation's centerpiece, a case study on Meridian's 3 most successful recent acquisitions, relied heavily on a sourcing narrative that certain analysts on the deal teams had found overstated. Fowler was not a whistleblower. He was a cautious young man who liked his job and noticed things. He mentioned it to Nora's office through a contact he didn't know was connected to Kessler Bridge. Nora passed it to Lyra without comment. Lyra read the note. Then she looked at the presentation deck. Dorian had left open on his laptop that morning while she brought him coffee. The sourcing narrative was not overstated. It was fabricated, cleanly, professionally, with the kind of polish that came from someone who had practiced not telling the truth until the lie had better posture than the fact. She closed the laptop gently and went to work. There was one moment, in the 3rd week of preparation, when everything nearly broke her. Not the evidence, not the legal exposure, not even the accumulation of small cruelties Dorian had performed with so much ease for so many years. It was a photograph. She found it in a box in her father's study while looking for a secondary set of trust documents Hartwell needed. The photo was from Lyra's parents' anniversary dinner 20-some years earlier. Her father was laughing at something off camera. Her mother, who had died when Lyra was 14, had her hand over her mouth in the way. She laughed when something surprised her into joy. Lyra sat on the floor of that study for a long time with the photograph in her hands. She had grown up watching her father protect her mother's memory the same way he protected the company. Not loudly, not with speeches, but with structure, with intention, with the quiet insistence that what mattered should be guarded. She looked at the box, at the trust documents beneath it, at the photograph on top. She thought about the man who had stood at an altar in Charlottesville and looked at her like she was the point where everything came together. She did not know, even now, whether that had ever been true. She only knew it had stopped being true before he found the courage to say so, and that the distance between those 2 moments was the shape of the damage she was still measuring. Her phone rang. Hartwell. The outside counsel has cleared the investor presentation package for inclusion, he said. All records are verified, preserved and linked to documented misconduct. The Ethics Review Board has signed off. Lyra stood slowly. She put the photograph in her coat pocket. She walked out of her father's study and did not look back at the door. "Then we proceed," she said. The morning of the investor presentation, Dorian left early. He was in a good mood. He had chosen a new tie. He had eaten breakfast standing at the counter and told Lyra the event was going to change the conversation around what this firm can do. She said, "I'm sure it will." He did not ask if she was attending. She was not on the guest list he had submitted. He had told her about the event in general terms, the way people mention things they don't actually expect to be questioned about. What Dorian did not know, Lyra held a controlling investor credential from Kessler Bridge. She had held it for 2 years. She had never used it publicly. She was going to use it today. She arrived 40 minutes before the presentation through the building's secondary entrance, with Hartwell and Nora beside her and Petra a half step behind. She wore her mother's earrings, small gold ovals, plain and warm, that her father had kept in his desk drawer for 20 years after her mother died, because he said they looked too much like something that should still be worn. She had taken them the morning after his funeral. She had worn them at every significant moment since. Fowler Reed was standing near the registration desk when she entered. He recognized Nora first, went slightly pale, and then looked at Lyra in the careful way of someone recalculating a situation he thought he understood. Lyra looked at him steadily. "You passed a concern to Nora's office 3 weeks ago." Fowler swallowed. Yes, thank you," she said. "That's all." He nodded, visibly relieved, and returned to his post. Inside the presentation hall, 80 people found their seats, board members in the center, limited partners along the right aisle, institutional investors in the front rows. Meridian's senior staff clustered near the back. Dorian stood at the front with his co-presenter, Payne Whitfield 44, Meridian's Director of Investor Relations, reviewing the deck on a laptop beside the podium. The room had the pleasant, self-congratulatory hum of a group of people who had made money together and were about to hear a story that confirmed they were right to do so. Lyra sat near the left wall, partly in shadow, her Kessler Bridge credential tucked in the inside pocket of her coat. She was not hiding. She simply was not the kind of woman who required a spotlight to know what she owned. She saw the moment Dorian noticed her. He was mid-sentence with Payne. His eyes moved across the room with the automatic scan of a man expecting only allies, and they landed on her for exactly 2 seconds before moving away. His posture changed, not much, just slightly, the way a structure shifts when something heavier than expected steps onto it. Payne introduced him. The room applauded. Dorian walked to the podium with his easy, practiced confidence. "Meridian Capital's success," he began, "has never been accidental. It has been the product of vision, discipline, and the kind of instinct that doesn't apologize for being right." He paused for the appropriate laugh. It came. "Today I want to walk you through the 3 acquisitions that defined our trajectory over the last 3 years. These are the deals that built this firm's reputation in the market. These are the deals that, frankly, I believe represent the most important work of my career." In the back of the room, Cressida Pell sat between Petra and a Kessler Bridge legal associate. She had driven from Philadelphia that morning. She was wearing a gray blazer that was slightly too warm for the room, and she had not let go of the folder in her lap since she arrived. She looked at the ceiling once, then across the room, then back at her folder. Her hands steadied. Lyra looked at Hartwell. Hartwell entered the authorization code into the secure terminal at the side wall. Nora confirmed the legal seal. The Kessler Bridge compliance officer, patched in remotely, gave a single confirmations tone. Dorian moved to the first slide. The screen went black. 3 seconds of silence. Dorian reached toward the laptop. Payne frowned. Then the Kessler Bridge corporate seal appeared on the screen. Not Meridian's logo. The seal of the company that owned Meridian's controlling stake. Dorian went still. The first document appeared without music, without narration, printed white on the massive screen in plain, clean font, carrying the authentication stamp of Kessler Bridge LLC. Origination Credit Review. Meridian Capital Group Acquisitions 2022-2024. Initiated by Controlling Ownership Authority. All findings verified by outside forensic counsel. A sound moved through the room. Not quite a gasp, something more like recalibration. The second document appeared. A side-by-side comparison. Cressida Pell's internal sourcing memo, dated 14 months before the acquisition announcement, against Dorian's credit narrative submitted to the board. The sourcing language in Dorian's version was Cressida's language. The contact list was Cressida's contact list. The valuation framework was the framework Cressida had built over 8 months of market research and had presented to her supervising director 6 weeks before she was quietly moved off the deal team. Someone near the front said, very quietly, "That's the same document." The third section appeared. the settlement fund disbursement, the operating account it had been drawn from, the Kessler Bridge capital that had funded it. Dorian's voice came out louder than he intended. Someone is hacking the system. This is not authorized. A calm, even voice responded from beside the screen. Hartwell Briggs, 67, Ashworth family attorney and trustee of Kessler Bridge LLC, stepped forward with a binder in one hand and his reading glasses in the other. This presentation has been authorized by the controlling ownership authority of Meridian Capital Group, Hartwell said, pursuant to documented fiduciary misconduct by senior executive personnel. All records displayed are preserved under legal hold and reviewed by outside counsel. This action is not a personal grievance. It is a corporate response. Payne Whitfield stepped back from the podium. Two board members turned toward each other. Neither spoke. The next slide appeared. Cressida's original deal files, time-stamped, authenticated, and notarized. The emails Dorian had sent when she was being moved off the team. His reply to a colleague who had flagged the credit discrepancy. She got research credit. That's the level of contribution that was made. The colleague's response, never sent, only drafted and saved. That's not what happened, and we both know it. Dorian moved toward Hartwell. You need to stop this. I don't know who is behind this, but this is illegal. You're destroying an event with 80 investors in the room. Hartwell's voice did not change in volume or register. The investors in this room are the parties this disclosure is intended to reach. That is precisely why the format was chosen. Dorian turned toward the room. He was still looking for someone to hand him an exit. He looked at board members. He looked at Payne. He looked at the back of the room. He found Lyra. She had stepped out of the shadow near the left wall. She stood in the aisle now, still, her mother's earrings catching the light from the presentation screen. Behind her, Nora held a tablet. Petra stood slightly to the left. Hartwell was already moving toward the disclosure podium. Cressida had risen from her seat and was standing near the back wall, holding her folder, and for the first time in 2 years, she was not gripping it like a shield. She was holding it the way a person holds something they are about to hand over to someone who finally has the authority to take it. Dorian's face moved through several things in rapid succession: confusion, then recognition, then something Lyra had never seen on him before, a kind of vertigo, as if the floor of the room he had believed he owned had just revealed it was not a floor at all, but a surface someone else had been maintaining. You, he said. Lyra looked at him. Yes, you own Kessler Bridge. I own Kessler Bridge. He shook his head slowly. You never said, you never told me. You never asked what my family built, she said. You decided what I was worth and stopped looking. That landed the way truth lands when it doesn't need to be raised. Not loudly, but into silence, where everyone can hear its shape. Dorian's voice dropped. We can handle this privately. Lyra turned toward the room. Cressida Pell's work built 3 of this firm's most profitable acquisitions. Her name appeared nowhere in the credit narrative presented to this board. A fund controlled by my family was used to settle her complaint and ensure her silence without board knowledge or authorization. She paused. Kessler Bridge is initiating formal review proceedings against Dorian Voss for origination fraud, fiduciary misrepresentation, and unauthorized use of operating capital. Outside counsel will contact the relevant parties this week. All executive access has been suspended effective today. Hartwell stepped forward with a sealed envelope and placed it on the table beside the podium. Dorian looked at it. He did not move toward it. Meridian Capital Group, Lyra continued, was built by people who believe deals should be made honestly and credit should go to the people who earned it. That standard is not negotiable. It does not become negotiable because someone in authority decides their ambition is more important than the institution they were trusted to serve. She looked at Cressida. The work you did is on record. The company intends to correct the credit attribution on all 3 acquisitions and will address your compensation accordingly. You will hear from Hartwell's office this week. Cressida's jaw tightened. She nodded once. Her eyes were bright, but she did not cry. She had used up her crying a long time ago, in another city, in an apartment she had moved out of because she couldn't afford it, once the settlement terms restricted where she could work. The room remained quiet, not the quiet of approval, not yet. The quiet of 80 people recalibrating who they were in relation to what they had just witnessed. Then one of the limited partners near the right aisle, a woman in a charcoal blazer who had been in private equity for 30 years and who had a particular talent for identifying the exact moment when a room needed someone to stop holding its breath, began to applaud. Not loudly, not theatrically, just steadily. Someone beside her joined, then the row behind, then the back section where the Meridian analysts were sitting, the people who had known, in the ambient, unspoken way of junior staff, that something in the sourcing narrative had not been right, and who had stayed quiet because silence felt safer than the alternative. Dorian stood at the front of the room and received the sound of it. He did not stay long. He picked up his jacket from the chair beside the podium and walked toward the side exit. No one stopped him. No one called his name. He left the way people leave when they finally understand the room does not belong to them. Payne Whitfield, to his credit, sat back down in the front row and did not follow him. The weeks after were not simple. Lyra had not expected them to be. There were attorneys and depositions and a board restructuring process that required 17 separate conversations with people who had built careers around Meridian and needed to understand that the company's foundation had not changed, only the person responsible for protecting it. There were press inquiries, carefully managed. There was a formal process to correct Cressida's compensation, which took 6 weeks and 3 rounds of negotiation because Cressida's attorney, appropriately, was not willing to settle fast. Dorian did not contest the executive suspension. His personal attorney sent a letter that was measured in tone and thin in substance. The forensic review of the 3 deals left very little room for a counter-narrative. The divorce was filed 31 days after the investor presentation. Lyra did not feel the thing she had braced for. She had expected grief or relief or the particular exhaustion of a chapter finally ending. What she felt instead was something quieter and harder to name. A kind of clarity, as if a fog she had grown so accustomed to that she had stopped noticing it had simply lifted one morning and left the air sharper and colder and more honest than it had been in years. She went back to her father's study the evening the divorce papers were signed. She sat in his chair and looked at the desk. The yellow legal pad was still there. The reading glasses he had always misplaced were folded beside the lamp. She put the photograph back on the desk, her parents at the anniversary dinner, her father mid-law, her mother surprised into joy. She touched the edge of the frame. "I answered with truth," she said to the room. The room did not answer, but it didn't need to. Some silences are not empty. They are full of every voice that taught you how to stand inside them without needing someone else to speak first. Cressida Pell's name appeared on 3 acquisition records 6 months later in the corrected and filings submitted to the institutional investors. The deals had returned significant value. Her origination credit would follow her career for the rest of it. On the morning the corrected filings were published, Lyra received a message from Cressida. It said only, "My daughter asked me last night what I do for work." I didn't change the subject. Lyra read it twice. Then she walked through the main entrance of the Meridian building. Not the secondary door, not the side corridor she had used for 2 years while she waited to understand what she was dealing with. The main entrance, with the glass doors and the lobby that still carried her family's capital in its walls, whether anyone knew it or not. The woman at the front desk looked up. "Good morning, Ms. Ashworth." Lyra Ashworth, 36, active controlling authority of Kessler Bridge LLC and majority investor of Meridian Capital Group, walked across the lobby in her mother's earrings and her father's discipline and the name her husband had never thought to look up. She wore no title on her coat. She needed none. Some women are quiet because the room hasn't earned their voice yet. And when it finally does, the quiet turns out to have been the loudest thing in it all along.